Let's talk about Iran, because what's unfolding right now is one of the most serious internal crises the country has faced in years, and it could spill well beyond its borders. First, what sparked the protests? The current wave of protests began on December 29th, and at first, this looked familiar. People were angry about the economy. The currency was collapsing, inflation was surging, and daily life was getting harder fast. But something changed last week. On the night of January 8th, protests exploded in scale. Thousands of people took to the streets, especially in Tehran and other major cities. And this time, the demands went far beyond economics. Protesters were openly calling for the end of the Islamic Republic, and in some cases, even for the return of the monarchy. That's a red line for the regime. How did the government respond? The response was predictable and brutal. The regime shut down the internet, cut communications across the country, and unleashed its internal security forces and military units to crush the demonstrations. We're still piecing together what happened because information is tightly controlled, but the scale of violence appears severe. Credible reports suggest at least 2,000 protesters may have been killed, possibly more. The regime itself admits that over 100 security personnel also died. As of January 13th, protests are still happening, mostly at night, but they're smaller now. Is the regime about to fall? Short answer, no, at least not yet. The Islamic Republic still has a large, loyal security apparatus. There are no visible splits in the leadership or the military. The bigger risk isn't sudden regime change, it's slow regime erosion. If protests keep coming back, and especially if the U.S. intervenes militarily, the government could become increasingly dependent on the Revolutionary Guard and the military to stay in power, which usually means even more violence, not reform. Now, let's talk about the United States. President Trump has been very clear. On December 30th, he said the U.S. would intervene if Iran's government killed protesters. Since then, he's repeated the threat multiple times, including explicitly mentioning military force. At this point, the threat looks credible. There's a real chance the U.S. launches strikes in the coming days. What would a U.S. strike look like? This is important. A U.S. strike is unlikely to be about regime change. Washington has a few options on the table: limited airstrikes, cyber operations, sanctions, support for communications tools like Starlink, increased backing for opposition figures. If missiles fly, the most likely targets would be internal security forces, like the base-age paramilitaries. But here's the catch. Even if strikes show symbolic support for protesters, they probably won't change the internal balance of power. In fact, they could backfire by allowing the regime to blame the unrest on foreign interference. A long U.S. air campaign could seriously weaken the regime, but that would mean a major commitment. So if a strike happens, expect it to be limited. Would Iran respond? Yes, but carefully. Iran would feel compelled to respond to show strength, especially during a domestic crisis. But it would likely avoid direct escalation with the U.S. Possible responses include attacks on U.S. bases or ships in the region, cyber operations, limited proxy activity. What's less likely is a full-scale escalation in the Strait of Hormuz or widespread proxy warfare, unless Iran's own oil exports are directly targeted. Tehran also wants to avoid damaging relations with Gulf Arab states. The wild card: U.S. tariffs on Iran's trading partners. There's another pressure point here. Trump has threatened to impose a 25% tariff on any country doing business with Iran, so-called secondary tariffs. This would be similar to what the U.S. attempted with Russian oil buyers. But key questions remain. Which countries would be targeted? Would the U.S. really enforce this? And how far is Washington willing to push? China is Iran's most important trading partner, but escalating tariffs on China would almost certainly provoke retaliation, especially around critical minerals, something the U.S. is highly sensitive to. So while the threat raises pressure, it's unclear how aggressively it will be used. So what are the odds of regime change? In the near term, low. The Islamic Republic is battered but resilient. Protesters are brave but fragmented. The security forces remain loyal. The more realistic downside scenario is slow collapse, not sudden overthrow, driven by repeated protest waves, economic pressure, and possibly limited U.S. strikes. Whether Iran moves in that direction depends on two things: whether protests reignite at scale, whether the U.S. decides to escalate. For now, the system is holding, but it's under more strain than it's been in years.